And with this new little bit of knowledge, just that, you already have that Maserati engine inside your brain, because now it's up to you whether you use it or you don't in the ways we're looking at. And all I'm giving you is just a tidbit of the information. But it is a priceless tool. Not to mention what I said, a few minutes ago about the different things you can do, about keep learning new things, giving yourself challenges, the walking, etc., etc. So all of those things are the equivalent of putting a Maserati into this Volkswagen. And that's why I find this whole subject so interesting, so fascinating, because I know every time I learn something new, I have greater possibilities for just myself. And of course, those whose lives maybe I touch a little bit. Okay, so now we've been walking into the field of neuroscience, and I just want to talk a little bit about neural pathways. All these neural pathways are the neural structure of your brain, and as we'll see in a few minutes, it's not just the prefrontal cortex that we're talking about, although that is what most people focus on. The prefrontal cortex is the bit behind your forehead, and is the bit that does your executive functioning, that does a lot of your cognitive rational thinking, right? That's that part of the brain. But it's the whole brain that's important. And we've seen a little bit about, through the geriatric studies and so on, how this can be changed. Now, I'm going 1 year back to 2003. I was in 2004 a minute ago about the three brains. 2003, I was at Harvard for a symposium, and I was just a lowly part of a symposium from a Miami university. But there was a keynote speaker at this Harvard conference. Her name was Elaine Baer, although I later got her books and was not as excited by her books as I was by her speech that day. In that speech, she said this: everything you think, feel, say, do, and how you react will influence your neural pathways, your genes, and your very DNA. Now, this was not news to me, but it was news to me that the scientific world was saying it. I knew about this for years through, if you like, esoteric, spiritual thought, Eastern religions, and so on. This was something I knew about, but not something you really ever talked about because people would laugh at you and tell you you're crazy. And here was this very revered and renowned keynote speaker at Harvard saying these very things. I remember I was writing some notes while she was giving her keynote, and I almost jumped in my seat when she said that. Yes. So I came back to Marbella. I was already living here when that happened. I came back to Marbella, and I told a surgeon I'm friendly with here, a Spanish surgeon. I told him about this. I was so excited, because this was now science, and I knew this particular surgeon had no time for anything that was not scientific. And I explained it to him, obviously in Spanish, and he looked at me and gave a little smile, patted me on my shoulder and said, "And you believed it." So. Okay, so now, if we look at everything I've told you prior to this Harvard little talk, and now what this woman at Harvard said in her keynote, you already understand that for this to work for you, you need to practice being here, present, if you like, mindful, at all moments of your day, but in particular, as she was saying, because she gave a lot of examples, of practical examples, when you play the piano or whatever it is you play. I don't play anything, but I've found my own examples. When you read, when you play golf, if that's your thing, when you're writing an email, when you're having tea with your 3-year-old granddaughter with plastic cups with no liquid in it, but you're having tea with her, right? Or when you're having a conversation with your spouse or your children, are you really there? Because if you are not, you're not doing anything of what we're talking about. Really there means, just like I am now really here with you, but let's say for me that's easier because I have to focus on my talk. Otherwise, who knows what I'd wind up talking about, right? So for me to be here with you right now in giving this talk is simple. But you guys, You might be interested, you might be listening, but you might have noticed a couple of times you got lost in your own thoughts. Because something I said made you think of who knows what, and you went blah, 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 down that road, and maybe 30 seconds later you come back to the talk. You lost those 30 seconds because you were not present. Being present has nothing to do with being respectful to a speaker. Being present has to do with a habit. A habit that, as this woman said, once you properly practice it, it will influence your neural pathways, your genes, your very DNA. Which takes us, by the way, to the topic of genetic determinism, although that's not really where I want to go. But if we have time at the end, I can say a little bit about that. Because if you believe that you can change your genes and your DNA, and that it's evidence-based science that is saying this, then you already know that the old-fashioned model, where we all believed we are born with X set of genes, maybe my parents had a heart attack, diabetes, cancer, who knows what, so I probably have those genes, so it's very likely that that might happen to me. Not so. They have proven that this is not so. But as I say, that's a topic for another day. So of course, what you need to also be doing in this searching for changing your neural pathways, you look for joy in your day. You look for choices at every step of the way. Choices in something as little as driving here. Maybe an idiot in front of me was causing me to drive too slowly, and I wanted to get here because I wanted to buy my coffee. and now I have a choice. Do I become impatient? Or do I think, oh, what's wrong with you? Or do I just look out the window and see the beautiful concha or the sea or whatever it was I was seeing as I was driving, right? This is a choice. Never mind the bigger choices. And as you practice this more and more, your neural pathways change. And we're going to talk about some much more difficult stuff in a minute, but this, you who theoretically don't have these difficult neurological issues, you can use this very simple stuff to make huge differences in your life. In your personal life, your emotional life, your professional life, your intellectual, all of this can improve for the better. I always kind of think it's almost magical, like it's almost like Harry Potter stuff. It's so incredible that this can be. In the Deutsch book, which is this one here, in the Deutsch book, there's a quote that I really liked, and it was, "Your brain gets better at what you choose to do and what you do more frequently." Now, what I choose to do might be, I maybe choose how to learn how to cook. And then, of course, the more I do it, the better I cook. Sure, that's a simple example. But how about this? Am I choosing how to become more patient, more loving, more kind, less judgmental, maybe gossip less, maybe, you name it. I'm sure all of us, if we wrote a little private note to ourselves, could come up with 15 things that aren't actually that nice about ourselves, right? That we could theoretically all do something about it. But it's a choice. So if you do more of it, if I become more patient every day, just a little bit, I get better at being patient, etc., etc. All these other things we've talked about. So now let me tell you some examples of neuroplasticity. The first ones are dealing with physical issues, and then at the end I'll give you an example that pertains more to those of us who don't have a physical issue, but who would like to improve our lives just because we know about neuroplasticity. So the first example, which if I'm not mistaken is from the Deutsch book, but by now you can find it anywhere. I think I've even seen it in talks with the Dalai Lama, who by the way has amazing talks with neuroscientists, available on YouTube. So in this particular example, and perhaps I spoke about this in another talk I gave here, simply because it's related to how the brain can change. Imagine you suffer a stroke, and you are now essentially paralyzed on one side of your body. And your neurologist tells you, well, you can get some physiotherapy, but they're not really giving you much hope for regaining the full use of your left side. The neuroscientists and the neurologists who work with this have been saying now for some years that the way you do it, you take the person to rehab, you put a sling on the good arm, and then you place the arm that is paralyzed on a table, and you tell them to move it. And of course they can't, right? But you don't do it to torture them. You do it for a very specific neuroscientific reason. Maybe you put something that's big enough, let's say the bottle of water, close to their hand, but not close enough for them to touch it unless they are able to move the hand. And you explain to them, now what you've got to do, using your brain, you just imagine that you're sending the order down, 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 into your hand and your fingers so that you can grasp that bottle. And you practice doing that for, 45 minutes. And then you come back tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And whether it takes you 3 weeks or 2 months, most typically you will regain use of that paralyzed arm. Why? Because another part of your brain jumps in. So the tissue that was affected by the stroke is dead. That tissue is never going to help you move this arm. But the healthy tissue, very close, adjacent to that dead tissue, we could say it's in a bit of an uproar because of what happened. It's not firing properly. It needs instructions, and it needs instructions that are calm, to calm it down. So I'm not suggesting you play lullaby music. It's not that kind of calm, right? You need to simply, we could call it reorganize the brain in new ways, which is neuroplasticity. So by you, in your rehab, thinking these thoughts, to travel, for the order to travel down into your fingers, to be able to grasp the bottle of water, you are training another part of your brain that is still healthy to take over the job of the dead part. And it does. Look this up. It is, if anybody has a stroke and isn't lucky enough to have a doctor who thinks this way, find them somebody who does.
Are we just, in this case, using the stroke as an example, just using the brain, we're not using the heart or the intuition, just the brain?
Yeah, because this is less about making choices as it is about retraining or training newly a portion of the brain that wasn't doing this before. Think of London cabbies or London Uber drivers. But anyway, people who drive other people around the city to make money. Obviously, London is a very complicated city in which to be a cabbie. They have shown, again in these earlier neuroscientific studies, that London cabbies have a certain section of the brain that has to do with geolocation, right? I have lived in the area of San Pedro for decades. I don't actually know San Pedro because I have never exercised that part of my brain. I've never wanted to. I don't like San Pedro. I mean, I live outside of San Pedro, but if I have to go somewhere, I prefer to go elsewhere. So this geolocation of a London cabbie is extremely developed, as is a concert violinist. What's he doing? He's got it here, and then he does this, right? So this hand and this hand, just like in the guitarist, but even more so with the violinist, is much more developed in the brain, I mean, the part that corresponds to that hand, than it would be in you and me. Now, in the case of the stroke victim, we are doing something slightly different. We're getting a healthy part of the brain, perhaps the part of the brain that takes care of this arm, right, that is still working, now takes on an additional responsibility. How is that possible? The brain is plastic. The brain can grow new stuff as long as you give it the right information. Okay? So this is absolutely wonderful. You can listen to these things on TED Talks with Norman Deutsch. Norman Deutsch has a lot of YouTube talks out there, interviews. Many of them are kind of old because when